I'm not, if anybody's ever seen me speak before, you know I tend to walk around a lot. So I'm not used to standing here next to the microphone, but it was either that or juggling two things. I think one at a time is probably fine. So just really, we all have our own idea of what solutions to freight looks like. And when we were talking through the title of this, I deliberately wanted to try and pull away from the solutions. I'll explain why in a minute. But we've all got different experiences, and I think that's the critical thing, and that's why, as Mike just said, the networking will always win over the presentations, because talking to people and sharing stuff is incredibly important. So let's just take a bit more of a global view. Basically, a logistics operator is paid to find us wherever we happen to be in the world. Wherever you are, if you'd arrived here, got on your smartphone, and you'd ordered an air conditioning unit, it would have been here within the hour by Amazon or somebody else, I'm sure. Somebody could have delivered it to us. Don't believe it? Basically, if they're paid to deliver it, that is what their job is. Do you need a phone box in the middle of a desert? I doubt it. But somebody has used it as a bit of marketing. Yeah? Basically, they will do whatever we ask them to do. We all know that urban freight is incredibly complex. When you look at the amount of stuff that we move and we insist on moving, whether it's clothes, tables, food, the waste, anything. And what that complexity does is it means it's very difficult for us, if we work in the public sector or researchers, to get our hands around and try and understand what is it we're trying to influence. So we know that the majority of it happens on the road network. We know the majority of it's happening across the curbside. We know a lot of it is happening at the times when we don't want it to happen, and we also know it's polluting our environment. But it's a commercial activity, and we have to remember the commercial facts behind logistics chains if we want to influence that. We know from our own perspectives, having worked in a city, there's basically 4 reasons why any city wants to manage urban freight. The highest on the list of priorities is usually about emissions. That's usually air quality emissions, but maybe CO2. We talk about safety, we talk about livability, we talk about better streets, healthier streets. Congestion, which in a sense is potentially adding to or reducing both the safety and the air quality issues. But we also need to factor in the economy. You end up in a situation, if you're not careful, you try and manage urban freight, and all you do is you increase the costs. So it becomes less affordable for your residents. So we know that's a problem. We've also got different scales of problems. So if you look at the 2 pictures, the picture on the top is Beijing on a Monday, after a Communist Party meeting the previous week, and the bottom picture is the Thursday morning of the same week. So 3 days, Beijing. That's the difference in air quality. They've had a lot better, this is from last year, these pictures. They had a lot better year this year, basically because of the atmospherics. So basically the wind was blowing more of the pollution to the other parts of China rather than Beijing. However, go back to the fact that cities want to manage freight. Freight operators are actually working on behalf of logistics. Freight is the vehicles that move, logistics is the stuff that we all order. And those 2 factors, bear in mind, is all about cost and service. As I said earlier, if you pay for something, you can get what you want. You can get somebody to deliver your shopping and put it in your fridge. You can get somebody to more or less throw it out the back of the van at any time that suits them. Depends on what you pay. The operators need to be able to deliver a predictability of journey time. So what that means is, when we talk about cities managing congestion, there is something in the operator's work package that's what they're important about, is looking at how fast and how effectively their vehicles move. So there's a commonality of needs there that too often we overlook. The operators are not the enemy, they're often part of the solution. And particularly as the daily costs, I don't mean the vehicle cost of buying the vehicle or anything else, but if you talk about the daily operating costs of the vehicle, basically it's the driver and the fuel. If they can save the driver through a connected and autonomous vehicle, they might easily do it, as long as there's somebody to unload it. But if they can save fuel, they will certainly look to save fuel. It's cost, it's profit. But there's variable levels of success in terms of what cities and operators are doing. Why is that? As I said, it's a commercial activity. There's a limited understanding from the cities. There's a whole series of the facts of why manage freight when you can try and deal with cycling, because increasing cycling is so much more positive and is so much more fulfilling, perhaps, as a city officer. We've also got existing city cultures and lack of data. So I said Beijing. I went to Beijing last year. The picture is the picture of the traffic on an average day in Beijing. If you look and if you count, there are 5 ring roads there. They are building the 6th ring road as we speak. So consequently, their culture is build it. Keep building the solution will come. I suggested even in Beijing, and I'm still here, that was perhaps the wrong solution. There's also the fact that cities tend to talk to themselves. We're brilliant at talking to ourselves. We're not very good at sharing that with the operators in a way that they understand. We also tend to go straight for the solutions. What's the solution? It's a consolidation centre. But what problem are you trying to fix? What outcome are you trying to achieve? And basically, freight isn't integrated into mobility planning. Very often, people treat freight as a separate subject. And actually, cities function by people moving around. And the next time you move and you buy some shopping or you buy a cup of coffee, you are freight. You are basically moving stuff. It's not a separate activity at all. Now, thankfully, a lot of work has been done to actually make sure we understand how we can start to manage it. And the guidance that came out in January that Mons talked about earlier, and details about sustainable urban mobility plans and sustainable urban logistics plans is great. The problem with some of this stuff is, unless you have got a lot of time to sit there and read, all that theory doesn't really help. Because basically, as humans, we understand more by talking and sharing and all the rest of it. And you prove that again at the coffee break, because that's what we all do. It's a lot more fun to talk to people. So the guidance exists, great. We recognise in the EU that actually you need more than that. So there's a whole series of EU projects, and we're here to celebrate the success of, sorry, that wasn't a pun, it was just happened to be the wrong word, the achievements of these 4 projects. And the important thing here is about transferability. It's about increasing the understanding, and as Henriette said earlier, the transferability into the US as well, and sharing that information backwards and forwards is incredibly important. And I know there's a couple of reps in the audience, and I've just come off the back of a different network, which was an URBAC network for urban freight transport, looking to produce integrated action plans. And what that did, interestingly, it didn't jump straight to the solutions or the actions. What it did is look at stakeholders and data and how to integrate as part and parcel of the action plans. And that's quite useful because what it's doing is saying, don't come up with a plan that you can do nothing with. So one of the cities that was in the Freight Tales network was Palma. Palma have been in an eco-logistics project. They've had a sustainable urban mobility plan. They've got a consolidation centre, and they're still struggling to make it work. So this feels to them like a way forward of actually starting to integrate that and also being able to talk it through with other people in similar circumstances. So before jumping to the solutions, I'm just going to look at 5 issues, because I think here are some of the core reasons why things work or don't work. First is stakeholders. We talk about stakeholders fairly blithely, and we tend to suggest there are a lot of internal stakeholders, which there are. However, by the time you looked at the businesses and the operators and the residents, who will never like anything we do, and the people who work and live in the city, who've all got a stake in what we're trying to do, the impact of the city authority is fairly passive. Basically, the city sets the rules and the regulations and doesn't actually do an awful lot on the street. Now, you might do if you've got some regulatory or police enforcement, but the principle is, on a day-to-day basis, the influence the city has on a street is left to the people and the people that use it. Academics are really starting to help us with this, because what they're starting to do is identify where the flows are and provide some of the data streams that we need to make this work. So there's a whole series of stakeholders that we have to understand. And when we're talking to stakeholders, we have to keep them with us, and we have to be open and honest. We cannot be in a situation where we expect them to tell us all the problems and not involve them in what the solution looks like. The next one that I want to talk about is technology. I've heard a number of people tell me that technology is the solution. Smart parking will work, smart curbsides, GIS data. It's all great. It's not the solution. It's part of a solution. We know that on-demand is increasing. We know returns are increasing. Amazon, who are the enemy, basically are now doing Amazon wardrobes where you can have all your shopping in terms of clothes delivered to you. You try on what you like, you keep what you like, and you send the rest back. Great. They used to be called shops, I thought, but there you go. Autonomous vehicles. So the little package robot at the top of that screen, operated by Starshop, great for moving stuff around, but they stop for pedestrians. Now, if you come from Germany or the Netherlands or the north side of Belgium, you may actually stop for the traffic lights, wait for the green man to come to you. If you're from south of Europe or the UK or South America or India, what's the traffic light? You go wherever, whenever. So automatic vehicles, great, but they're programmed to stop for pedestrians. What's that going to do culture-wise? There's also unintended consequences. So the app Uber in London, Uber is still operating the taxi service in London, basically increased the number of vehicles, private hire vehicles, by 80% in 7 years. Yeah? It increased the number of drivers by 100% in 7 years. So what that says is actually increasing employment, which is probably a good thing. Maybe the traffic isn't a good thing. So there's some unintended consequences. However, the smart cities work is a potential, providing we plan freight into it. Things like routing apps, centralized booking systems, and actually some of the engineering is going into these new vehicles is incredibly important. So new technology, like the Volvo vehicle recently announced, things like increasing the capacity of vehicles. Why do we treat vans and heavy goods vehicles as separate? What's wrong with two vans in one, as in a 6 or 7 ton vehicle? Very underused. We've then got land use. And this came up earlier in a couple of the talks, is just about actually supply chains are based on global and local stuff that's moving around. So as a result, what we need is we need a series of dropping off points. And every time you put a dropping off point and you take it into a warehouse or out of a warehouse or get a human involved, it adds cost. Issues, cost versus service. So we end up with all these national distribution centres, local distribution centres, etc. So in terms of if we're going to come up with a policy and a plan, we have to actually think about transport and land use strategy that's for both people and goods. And why do I put that picture there? Thanks to Letitia, who's here, and a number of other people in Paris. I'll use this as an example. Paris has actually started to think through, not just within the periphery, but across the city, how do we move this forward? How do we work with a structure of logistics premises that need to be in the city to make logistics sustainable and zero emission? And they've done that based on work within the department, working with the academics and talking to the stakeholders. So they're now, from 2016, they're on their second charter of actually talking to the operators and getting the operators to sign up and commit to what they're trying to do. Experimentation and engagement are the two takeaways from that. We've then got the customer. As individuals, think about your buying habits. Think about your family's buying and shopping habits. Think about your buying and shopping habits as a business if you order online. Free delivery, on-demand, returns. How many green consumers are there? How many people actually stop and think, I don't want my delivery through one of those companies, I want it through a different company? I would say almost none. Go back to the cost versus service. Does this get boring? There's some theories here that you need to understand. There's very low barriers to entry. If tomorrow I wanted to set up, I could go and buy myself a second-hand van and I'd be a logistics firm. Yeah, you need no more. There's low margins. There's huge competition. Those top companies are probably only taking 10% of the volume because it's subcontracted and subcontracted. And we've got zero hours contracts in all of those as well, so that you end up with people who actually are not DHL or whatever, they're just a contractor on behalf of. Different issue. So, does the customer care who delivers? I'd suggest not. But the customer has influence because we traditionally think about that relationship between the operator and the city in terms of trying to manage freight. If we're clever, we get the supplier involved. because we think, right, okay, so the supplier is important because their supplier is the operator, what they're working with. However, if you think about the customer actually influences those two because they're paying for the goods and services from the supplier and they're voting and they have to pay taxes to the city. The only relationship from the operator is they're trying to deliver to a customer who they actually don't know who they are or where they are or anything else. So there's something there about, is the customer the person who can solve it? Well, perhaps, but not with the operators. And finally, on commodities. So if you take a couple of the pictures, the picture at the top was taken in Washington, DC in January. Delivery of particularly bottled water, large-scale bottled water into offices. What's wrong with having a tap with a filter attached? Yeah? What are we moving? Why are we moving it? If you take the second picture, taken in Brussels last year. Brussels, the home of beer. What's that vehicle doing? It's delivering Chinese beer. Not saying you shouldn't be able to drink Chinese beer in Brussels. What I'm saying is, if you're going to drink Chinese beer in Brussels, why can't it be delivered with all the Belgian beer? Why is it in a separate vehicle? Don't know. So, separate vehicles, and it's interesting that both the U-Turn and the Success Project started to look at commodities and actually how do the commodity flows differ? Because there's a whole level of detail that the operators do that in a sense we have to understand and recognise. I'd also suggest there's something about suppliers. The supplier is becoming more important again. The integrator, the supermarket, is less important to us now than actually being able to buy it cheaply. And if the supplier can get the sale direct to the customer, they'll start to do something different. And we've also recognised that a lot of the solutions that appear to be working are local solutions. They're about local people cooperating in a neighbourhood, in an area, through procurement or something else. So in terms of the policies, there's something that says if your city wants to approach freight, they need to have a strategy that deals with both land use and transport and people and goods. And that needs to reflect the geography and the culture and the behaviours on the city. There's then a whole series of solutions. It says try and minimise the number of trips, match those trips to the network and mitigate the impact. And to be fair, that's a lot of the work that went into the London Transport Plan that the Mayor produced earlier in the year. It's perhaps less explicit than that. The important thing is, if we just concentrate on safer and cleaner, we're not going to achieve a lot. Because basically you get more bang for your money when you go up that network. And I'll come back to this in a minute. Why do I say this is important? Because if you think about, as I said at the beginning, stop looking straight for the solutions. We often say consolidation centre. Consolidation's a lot more deep than that. Because if you look at consolidation, what outcome do you want? You want fewer freight vehicles on the road. So a centre is another stage in the process. It works if there's an economic case like Heathrow. If you put a consolidation centre in Norwich, which is the far side of Cambridge in the UK, it's about a 2-hour journey to get to this one city. The consolidation centre they put in Norwich. I would argue they should put it in Cambridge. There might be a business case of saving fuel for the operator. And if you look at La Rochelle, and I know Tatiana's in the audience, La Rochelle have had a consolidation centre for 15 years, and it's been funded publicly all the way through, because the business case is still missing for it. But rather than spending lots of money on construction and consolidation, Transport for London spent 30,000 on business procurement. It worked with the business districts. They picked it up and ran with it. There's a whole series of things we can do. I've talked about centres, there's collaboration, there's collection points, there's group procurement. All of those things are proven to work. And the more those get socialised, I think the better, rather than us as cities trying to say, hang on a minute, what's the centre look like? Why this approach? And I'm conscious of time, I just need to try and speed up a bit. Basically, it's based on a whole series of things that seem to work. It's based on things that are easy to understand. Why do I say that? If you take the London experience, in 2003, they started working on freight. Produced a freight plan in 2007, 2008, but it was about engagement, but it was inward looking, really. It was big, complex plans. For the Olympics, it was 18 months to get as many operators as possible to change what they did. And really, it was a question of get a simple message out. Based on that simple message working, and looking at what everybody else has done. I mean, some of the people in the audience I know from a sugar project in 2010, by actually understanding what others do, the city has now got a plan, a transport plan and a land use plan that connect together, looking at transport and looking at both transport and land use. The same is true in Stockholm, at a slightly different scale, but based on a vision for the city and the city plan and the mobility strategy. The freight element of that is part of that strategy, and it fits. It's considered an integral part of the setup, based on very simple actions and having some dedicated resource. And similarly, across the Atlantic, Seattle that Chris mentioned earlier, I actually used it as an example before I even knew Chris was here, so it wasn't to flatter him. But based on actually understanding the data of what everybody else is doing in the city, what's coming over the next 20 years, they've now got a freight action plan which gives us a foundation to base on. And as he said, working with the Living Lab, working with the University of Washington, they can then work on that. As they've got a whole series of infrastructure changes coming, they know who to engage with, they can start the process, and what you've got at the bottom is a very clear, accessible website for the city to communicate out to people. So, what actions should we take as cities from all of that? If those are the 9 sets of solutions, how should we do it? Should we do it through voluntary basis? Should we regulate it? Along with the freight tales people, I was in Split last week in Croatia. So the sign on the, get me left and me rights, right? On the right is the Croatian for a restriction on loading, which comes off at 10 o'clock in the morning. So at 9:30, what's there? A car is parked in that space. So the regulation only works if enforcement goes in. Now, enforcement isn't the solution, but if you're going to put a regulation in place, enforce it. Otherwise, just scrap the regulations because they'll ignore it anyway. So I think the solution set, however you choose, whatever far up in that list you go, it's a combination of regulation and enforcement. It's a combination of incentives, which I'll come back to in a second, and voluntary stuff. The voluntary stuff is cheap. It tends to be PDFs. It tends to be case studies. It tends to be examples, pilots, whatever. And the regulation tends to be very easy for the politician, because the politician can stand there, they can make an announcement, they can get their face on television, but it may not solve the problem. The incentives in the middle, looking at how streets are designed, looking at what the city procures. Over 14% of GDP across the EU is public sector procurement. Which city, apart from Brussels, and Christoph keeps smiling at me on that, apart from London and Brussels, are really starting to look at how to procure goods and services that therefore can influence the behaviour. What the city also needs, because this stuff isn't necessarily free, but it doesn't need to be expensive. We don't need huge amounts of funding on some of this stuff. We need some staff who actually know what they're talking about and can network into other people who know what they're talking about, can learn it, can transfer that language between how the city talks and how operators talk. There's some stuff about leadership. It often needs political leadership to get this stuff off the ground, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you don't start somewhere. Engagement. You cannot ignore the stakeholders, and you can't ignore actually getting those stakeholders educated. And that's internal, within the city, within the administration, and externally. A lot of work's been done in London in terms of driver training to actually make sure drivers of heavy goods vehicles understand the city was trying to increase the amount of cyclists. Then flexibility. One thing is certain, how we order goods and services today will continue to change. So if we're stood here or sat here in 5 years' time, it will look different than it does now. And we need to be flexible with this, because if you do something that's about vans or about cargo bikes or about heavy goods vehicles, it'll go into a different vehicle. Basically, the vehicle is not that important. It's about the commodity, and it's about how the customer is actually ordering goods and services. So a brief set of conclusions, which really should be fairly self-explanatory from some of the stuff I've said before. But really, there needs to be some vision. What do you want the freight to look like? And pull those strategies together, and if possible, have clear targets. There needs to be a coordinated approach. If the transport department does something that the land use department doesn't know about, or that the people doing the energy action plan or the climate change plan don't know about, it's not going to work. It needs to be coordinated. And that may be beyond city level. If you're trying to influence freight in a small city, it may be important what the big city nearby is doing or what the other small cities are doing, because no city is an island, apart from perhaps Singapore, but anyway, we'll go past that one. Working with stakeholders is not optional. They all will have their own thing to say, and some of them may be at the extremes, but actually, if you listen to them, that's part and parcel of understanding what the problem is. Yes, we need more data. It's great there's so many academics here. I particularly have been trying to push a lot of the work between cities and academics. We need data, we need tools, we need modelling, but we need to do something. Because if we wait, like Beijing has been doing, you end up with a problem that just keeps getting worse. And experimentation and flexibility. We need to experiment to make it work. And finally, just a salutary lesson in terms of it may take time. The poster on the left is basically an advert for trying to increase mobility, people mobility around London, about trying to get Londoners to stand on the right on the escalator. And if you've ever been to London, we all do this religiously. It is exactly what we're taught to do from before we come out of the womb, and we do it. However, that poster is from the 1930s. Yeah, change doesn't happen overnight. It may take time. That's it from me. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian. At the risk of sort of promptly disagreeing with the speaker, I just would like to make a point based on Ian's excellent presentation, because you mentioned in that Transport for London started working on freight in 2003. And that's kind of true and kind of not true, because partly they started thinking about freight in 2000 because the mayor had written it into his transport strategy. And I think it's very important to understand how cities do things, because if the mayor hadn't written in the transport strategy that freight was something that needed to be addressed in London, they wouldn't have worked on it at all. Now, it took them nearly 3 years to work out how to work on it, and you could say that was rather slow, but in fact, it's a very important question about the top-down and the bottom-up here. They started working on it then, and Transport for London would not have been able to deal with what they did in the Olympic Games if they hadn't had the capability already from all the work that they'd done before. So I think that was a really interesting presentation, and that was just really to add a point to it and not to disagree with you.
No, I agree with Mike. It's all right.
Okay, we've got time for 2 questions for Ian. So if anybody would like to ask a question, you need to wave at me, and I come and give you the microphone. I think we should use the microphone for the question. Oh, yeah, Giacomo will give you the microphone. So, time for a question, if you want to ask. There's one right. Yeah, well done. You're right in the middle. That's made it difficult for him. Could you just say who you are, Eduardo?
Hello, hi. I'm Edoardo Marcucci from the University of Molde and University of Roma.
You have to hold it very close with you.
I would like to ask what's your opinion about the use of eco-labeling. One way of changing how people buy things is to make them aware of what the implications are. There are examples in other fields where people buy more costly things just because they want to show and they are concerned about the environment. Do you think this might apply also to urban freight logistics?
I think it could. Certainly in London, there was a scheme that they developed called the Freight Operator Recognition Scheme, which developed. It became fleet component to deal with fleets. It's now being picked up sort of nationwide, and that's about sticking a badge on the back of your vehicle. But more importantly, it's about the standard of what's behind it. I think the issue is how educated the customer is in understanding what their own purchasing decisions do. I think if you look at an eco-label on food that says this is an organic product, you sort of know what you're buying. If you said that this is a green shipment or a sustainable shipment of goods, what does that mean? Does it mean it was sustainable when it went into the factory, when it came out of the factory was in China, was it shipped? Which bit of the chain do you get into? And to be fair, I think most consumers, we worry about what it costs us, not necessarily anything else. Yeah, there's some green consumers, but few, I would say, to start with. It's an approach that may work in certain areas.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else would like to ask Ian a question? Okay. Ian, it was a really interesting presentation and very reflective based on obviously your experience, but also a lot of thinking about your experience since you left. So thank you very much for coming to the event and for all the support you've given to Urban Freight through as a practitioner and a policymaker. So thanks a lot for that. Thank you.